A gentleman named Brad has written to me. He has a group of young people that he wants to give a sense of the history that the phone phreaking of the 1970s was a part of. And these questions are given me with that in mind. I might as well answer it publicly, and I'm better at talking than tapping on a keyboard, so here goes. Dear Evan D., my first thought is to describe this wonder that the Bell Labs engineers came up with in an interesting way. That's why your tapes grabbed my attention. If you were talking to a group of smart young people, what would you tell them to convey the sense of marvel about the phone system of your time? Wow. You got your work cut out for you. Now, you see, you work with young people, and intrigue, just intrigue in general, can be at so many different levels. You can be intrigued in sort of an intellectual or a technical kind of way. You can be intrigued in an emotional kind of way. Let's say you meet a girl or a guy, and he or she is wearing a perfume or a cologne, and it's one of those brilliantly designed perfumes. I'm not talking about Axe body spray. Oh, God, makes you smell like you've just rolled around in the dumpster behind a dessert cafe. No, I'm talking about the really artful scents that have been come up with. Chanel number 5. This will really date me, but Polo by Ralph Lauren. Those scents have a way of intriguing the emotions. The network at my time did that for me. I don't think you can do that now. I just don't think that young people can be intrigued that way. But to appreciate the marvel intellectually, let me point out that in 1965, you had a nationwide network where all major cities contained switches that would enable people to direct dial long-distance calls anywhere in the US and Canada without operator assistance. And at that time, there were no computers, no processors in the network. Imagine a machine intelligent enough to do that, to be able to connect you to any telephone, to translate the number you dial, to route the call through the switches of the local switch you're working with, and then arrange for it to be routed through the nationwide network from coast to coast. In 1965, all the equipment necessary is in place, and there are no computers in the network. No computer smarts at all. Now, not all places could dial at that time, but that was just a matter of time to build the network. Had they not advanced from 1965 on and just built the network out using 1965 technology, they could have had everybody served all over the world without a single computer in the network. Now, what actually happened was that in 65, the number 1 ESS came out, which was an analog switching machine that had computer brains. In the late 60s, the long-distance switches, known as 4A crossbar switches, got a system called Electronic Translation System, ETS, which was a computer to take care of the translation function. As in, what does 212682 Murray Hill 2, where does that go? To answer that question, they had a computer to do it, but before 1969, they had an electromechanical way to do it, card translators. So when I look back at the old network, see, nowadays everything has a processor in it, and that's about to get even worse. Everything has a processor in it. In those days, nothing did. And it's almost impossible to conceive of a high-level, intelligent, technical system that has no processor. None. The number 5 crossbar switching system, which you'll have to read up on because I barely understand it, is probably the greatest marvel of the old network. I didn't especially like the number 5 crossbar system because I was looking at it from the outside and it didn't make any interesting sounds, and in the early days as well, it didn't provide me access to some of the cool things. But number 5 crossbar is actually a work of genius. It has the kind of smarts that only a computer could provide. This is the thing that is so inconceivable now. When you got a dial tone, you were connected to a thing called an originating register. Using relays, it would count your dial pulses, record the digits you dial, and then it was able to communicate the whole number that you dialed instantaneously, less than 200 milliseconds, using a kind of parallel communication called the 2 out of 5 code. I don't want to get into all the details, but it could communicate the whole number you were dialing, not over a data link, not using a modem, but with a lot of wires and relays. It would communicate it to a device called the marker. The marker was just a big bunch of relays that was smart enough to know how to come in for just a fraction of a second, receive the number the customer's dialing, plot a route between the customer's line and the outgoing trunk that was needed, operate the appropriate switches, also convey the telephone number, again, near instantaneously to the outgoing sender, the thing that would beep out the MFs or dial balls. And it would do that in a fraction of a second. And then the marker was off to connect someone else's call. A crossbar 5 office would typically have 8 of these things. If you walked into the office and you walked down the aisles, you were literally walking through the inside of a great machine. You would hear clicks coming from all directions. Click, 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 all directions. Every one of those clicks corresponded to one of the 8 markers that were responsible for making all the connections in the office, operating the appropriate crossbar switches. It was really a marvel. Now, of course, it was very expensive to have relays smart enough to do all that. But that's why they invented the whole common control concept. The idea was to have the really smart relay devices shared and used for just a moment by the whole switch. And they would just make the connection and go. Once the connection was up, the process of watching to see whether the person answered that was called or how long the call went or disconnecting when they hang up, that was relatively simple, and relays associated with each outgoing trunk could take care of that. So there were a lot of individual relays to do the simple things, but the complex things, there were only a few of those. Nowadays it would not be economical to do any of that kind of smarts with relays. You would have as few relays as possible now. In those days, they didn't have any other way to do it. The number 5 crossbar system, which you can read up on a little bit, good luck in explaining it to people. I barely understand it. But literally, that is probably the most amazing technical marvel of that time. No computers. So you can tell them that you have a network that is that intelligent with no computers in it. And then when they do put computers in it, they're acting as adjuncts. There is nothing digital. Nothing. All of the transmission systems that carried the sound of voices from coast to coast, it's done with vacuum tubes and some transistors in some systems. Nothing digital. There wasn't any T1. And then T1 carrier was brought into the network in 1969, but it only operated as a group of 24 or so trunks. It was still sandwiched in between parts of a network that were all analog. So it was digital just for a group of connections between Office A and Office B. But there was not an integrated digital network, not at all, not for a really, really long time. And they arranged it so these different switching machines were able to figure out how to route your call, even though one hand didn't know what the other was doing. I explain this somewhat, rather verbosely, in Long Distance. I guess it's called The Sounds of Long Distance Introduction, would be the official name of that. The next question is, what did you find most alluring about the network? Was it the sounds, or the girls, or was it something else? This question I cannot answer quickly. It turns out there are about 5 different axes that sort of converge to motivate me at that age to stay on the phone. I'm going to have to try to answer that question either at the end, and the answer will go on for like a half an hour, or maybe by the time I'm done with this, I can concisely put it all together, because there's 5 different reasons, and the girls is one of them. What I find about it now that's alluring is very different from the way it was before. Let me tell you how it is now. Now, it's the soundscape. And those analog sounds, how can I say this? There's something about natural sounds. Here's an example. If you live next to a waterfall, just a little creek running out back, you can open your window and the sound of that waterfall, usually the same every day if it hasn't rained recently, may soothe you to sleep. And despite the fact that that waterfall is very repetitive, it's the same sort of thing all the time, there's a way in which it is also unlimited, ever new, undefinable. You can define it in terms of certain parameters. It never gets louder than a certain amount. It has a general frequency range. But it is an analog phenomenon. And you're hearing what has been called the music of the spheres. You're hearing something natural when you listen to that waterfall out of your window. Now, you can play a CD of a waterfall that was recorded for a straight half hour, and you'll get a high-quality picture of a real waterfall. But it'll be the same high-quality picture every night if you use that to go to sleep by. So, if you're playing a CD of an analog waterfall, you've got a good picture of a real analog phenomenon. But it's the same picture all the time. And you're still losing something. The ever-newness of it is not captured in the sound. Now, there have been devices sold. I guess the last time I saw one of these was in the 90s, where it's a device that's combined with an alarm clock or a clock radio, and you can select a waterfall-like sound from that device. Let's just say that that is a far cry from hearing a waterfall out of your window. I don't know about you, but I would not want to hear one of those 1990s waterfall simulating devices as I was going to sleep, because I would experience a kind of neural fatigue from it. It would tire me out. Just the very opposite reason for why you might want to listen to a waterfall. I tell you the truth. If I had one of those machines sitting next to me, or just a little oscillating fan, I'd turn on the damn fan. I'd probably arrange it so that it couldn't oscillate, so it didn't bother me, making a gust of wind blow across me every few seconds. But I'd use the noise of the fan to go to sleep by, and that would be highly preferable to a repetitive sample of a waterfall being played over and over. So what I just explained there is my best explanation in response to your next question, which was, you said in one tape that you did not like digital sounds, but rather the original analog sounds. Why is that? What you just heard is the best explanation I can give. just to give you a sense of it. You sort of have to intuit this. I was very upset when CDs started to replace cassettes and LPs, but I don't want to go into that right now. Brad says, I like computers and the internet, but I am not tech savvy. I am a history guy. Oh, good for you. Glad to know there's a few humans. Well, anyway, let me go on. When I was at AT&T, the engineers marveled at the 4 ESS, but most of it went above my head. You mentioned the number 1 ESS. What was it, and what was so special about it? Well, tell you the truth, Ben and I hated the number 1 ESS. But in the early 1980s, I learned to do things with it that were just amazing. Let me start at the beginning. The number 1 ESS was the first computer-controlled switch for use in the general telephone network. It made connections in an analog way using very miniature little relays, but these were controlled by computer. The network that it had was really based on crossbar 5, although it was made to be a little more versatile. But it didn't have markers. All of the smarts were computerized, and they computerized as much as they could. So they had a piece of hardware to have you connected to receive your dial pulses, but that piece of hardware didn't even have the relays to store the number, the way crossbar 5 did. That piece of hardware wasn't even called a register. It was called a receiver. And so the computer part of the switch would remember the number you were dialing. The computer part of the switch would decide how to route the call. And once it did that, it would operate the relays. The relays were miniature and, compact and done with, what did you call those? Actually, they had 2 different kinds of networks, and I'm not the expert on this. Bill Acker was the expert on this. He just passed away recently. But he could talk about number 1 ESS with excitement. See, for him, things like how you would type in the commands to program a line or to change a trunk or a routing into originally a teletype is how they communicated with the thing. All that stuff was interesting to him. I couldn't give a damn. So the number 1 ESS for the Bell system was the beginning of really computer-controlled telephone switches. In the 1970s, we thought that the number 1 ESS was the switch of the future. Not so. It was just what they were putting in through the 70s and 80s. We saw the number 1 ESS replacing the panel switching system offices in New York City. And each time a panel switch, a particular type of switching system, the Bell system's first dial system, each time one of those was replaced with an ESS, it was a loss for myself and Ben. Because each panel switch had its own particular, well, it's like a grand piano, no 2 pianos sound and feel exactly alike. And if you were to come home one day and you found your grand piano replaced by a little Casio keyboard that made sort of a piano-like noise, you might be very upset. Well, that's what it was like to watch the panels being replaced by number 1 ESS. Ben and I didn't like them, and we were both somewhat impatient with Bill, Ben more than myself, for liking it so much. But Bill was more of a computer geek than I was, and so computery stuff he could get excited about. I never could. To me, an exciting technology is when in New Zealand they train their sheepdogs to respond to a series of distinct whistles that can be called by the shepherd from the remote hillside to herd the sheep. They can actually work with more than one sheepdog at a time, and the shepherd can do a distinctive whistle to call each dog by his whistle name and tell him which way to herd the sheep, and he can do that from the other hillside looking across the valley. That is technology that I find amazing. That impresses me. Nothing with computers does. In retrospect, I ended up partially appreciating the number 1 ESS, and in 1983, again, I'll refer you to one of the tapes. If you want to see what I figured out by myself pretty much, with a lot of help from Les, but I was the mastermind. What I figured out to do with number 1 ESS, listen to Centrex Quirks Highlights, I believe it's called. It's a pretty long program in itself, and it shows the highlights of a long series that shows what we could do with number 1 ESS. You won't understand any of it. It's not meant to be understood. But if you hear that and want to know how all that works, there is a 4-part series that actually goes through the whole thing, explaining everything down to the last detail for what you need to know how that all worked. So I ended up working with 1 ESS quite a lot in 1983, but it was never the same. It didn't really have the soul. And by 1983, I was no longer interacting with something real. I was interacting with bugs in the software, figuring out how to make it work, and it just was not the same as the 1970s freaking. But we certainly were able to do some amazing things.
Who is this?
Who's who?
Yeah, you got to say who's who.
We're all here.
Wait.
We don't know who we are.
Hello?
Hey, Moon Unit?
Yeah.
We're rebuilding the conference right now. Stand by.
Okay.
How you doing? Doing great.
This whole thing is really neat.
Isn't it? It really is.
And now we have a 5-way call.
Say no to measured surface. The present temperature is 69 degrees.
Hello down there. Now, would you like to hear the 3-way bridges drop? How's that? Once your incoming call is gone, then when you start flashing, instead of getting dial tones, you start going backwards.
That's incredible. That's like absurd.
We could stack these things up and then knock them down like a bunch of dominoes.
Hi.
That's the sound of an ad infinitum bridge stack dropping.
I think normally it'll work for you.
So number 1 ESS was very special to the Bell system because it was the beginning of, sort of modernity. But as it turns out, it was just a passing phase. The number 4 ESS that you mentioned was the first Bell system large switch that was entirely digital. In other words, it didn't have any analog connections made within it. Any connection coming into that switch would have its sound in digital form multiplexed through the switch, and all it was doing was switching bits from here to there. It's a very different way of running a telephone switch. The number 1 ESS had an analog switching network, but all the smarts were a computer. So it was a big milestone for the Bell system. There are very few of those left now. They've been almost all replaced. Is there a piece of Bell equipment that you think is particularly noteworthy? Well, there's different kinds of noteworthy. For the technological marvel, the number 5 crossbar is especially noteworthy. But as far as what it was like to use the network and hear it, there is one switching system in particular that's very noteworthy to me, and that is number 1 crossbar. The register sender is basically a big collection of relays, and one of the nicest sounds that you hear in crossbar 1 is in this next example. The most pronounced sound here is the sound of Ben's speeded up dial, which makes a loud razzing noise, but that's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the metallic sounds that you will hear between his digits and afterward. You just heard Ben, from his home phone in Bell Harbor, Queens, dial a 7-digit number, which, due to the way the call is routed, requires the register sender to send multi-frequency tones. 7 digits, which means 9 little beeps there. But you don't hear the tones, you just hear the clanging of the relays that are making the tones. It just so happens that the parts of it that you would hear operating when it was processing calls were almost like something alive. And each one had its distinctive signature. No two sounded alike. For example, here's one that is more subtle than the last one we heard, doesn't make as much clanging noise. And here are a few more, each one clangier than the last. Just to put these sounds we've been listening to in context, here's a call from Ben's house. As we would hear calls going through, you would spend a certain amount of seconds on a piece of equipment called the register sender. That was the thing that received the number that you wanted to call, and in number one crossbar, it also is responsible for outpulsing, that is, transmitting the called number to where you were going. The number one crossbar system came in two varieties. There was a number one crossbar system for end offices, that is, the office that gives people dial tones and actually makes your telephone line work. There was another version of the number one crossbar system called a crossbar tandem. The tandem is the switch that doesn't have phones in it. It connects one office to another, so it's the intermediate switch. No telephone lines, it just connects trunk to trunk. The number one crossbar system and the number one crossbar tandem, referred to usually as just XBT crossbar tandem, those were completely noteworthy from the point of view of phone freaks who enjoy the sound. If you were dialing long distance, and a crossbar tandem was the first tandem switch that your long distance calls went out through, it would let you hear the MFs typically.
I'm sorry. The number you have reached is not in service or temporarily disconnected.
The Bell system used to actually advertise that. They deliberately made it so that you could hear the MFs. I think it was promotional, and it also kept people on the line so they could hear noises, so they knew something was happening after they dialed the number. That choice to let us hear the MFs created such a beautiful, beautiful sound.
I'm sorry. The number you have reached is not in service at this time. If you need assistance, please hang up and dial your operator. This is a recording. I'm sorry.
The Sounds of Long Distance Program 2 is a good place to go to get a feel for the beauty of the long distance network and the contribution to the aesthetics that the crossbar tandem made. But you know, each electromechanical switch has its own noteworthy features, and of course, not just Bell system. There were independent switches as well that had a certain charm.
able to complete your call as dialed. Please check the number and dial again or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording. 9199.
The NX-1 seems to consider the busy signal the universal answer to everything.
I could talk about the virtues of each one, but I think I've answered enough on that.